Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And it's really fascinating because the source material we're looking at today frames it not just as some historical footnote, but almost as like a warning sign for today.
For us today.
Yeah.
So, it's kind of a look at history repeating itself, maybe, potentially.
Right. And how we might be able to learn something from, this event.
Yeah.
And so the source material we're using it dives into, all the reasons behind the destruction of Jerusalem.
Okay.
And it really, I think, tries to connect it to things that are happening in our own world.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a scary thought.
Yeah, it can be a little bit unnerving when you start to see those parallels.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think what's really interesting about this particular text is that it uses the destruction of Jerusalem as like a springboard to examine human nature and the choices that we make, and suggests that this historical event holds lessons that are timeless and universally relevant. So it's not just about what happened back then, it's about what we can learn from it and how it applies to us today.
That's really interesting. And I think one of the first things that the text does is hit us with this really powerful image of Jesus weeping over Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And you have to think about the context, right? It's the Passover.
Right.
It's a time of celebration and joy.
The city's teeming with pilgrims.
Exactly. City's absolutely packed.
Yeah.
And Jesus is gazing out at this magnificent city, and he's filled with sorrow.
Yeah, that's a striking contrast, isn't it?
It's a huge contrast, right?
Yeah.
Like, you think you'd be happy?
You'd think so.
It's a joyous occasion.
You would think so.
Why is he weeping?
Well, to really understand Jesus's reaction, you have to understand what Jerusalem meant to the Jewish people.
Okay.
This wasn't just their capital city.
Right.
It was the heart of their faith, their identity. It was the city of David, the place where the temple stood, a physical representation of their covenant with God.
Okay.
They believed that they were under God's protection, that they were secure because of their special status.
I see. So it's not just the physical beauty of the city that's moving him.
Right.
It's something much deeper than that.
Exactly.
And the text seems to say that it's not even really about the physical destruction itself.
It goes beyond that.
It's something even more profound than that.
Yeah. Jesus wept because he saw beyond that present moment. He saw the impending destruction, the unimaginable suffering that was about to unfold.
Wow.
But even more than that, I think he was grieving over the spiritual state of his people.
Okay.
He saw their rejection of his message, their refusal to recognize him as the Messiah, and he knew the consequences would be devastating.
Wow. It really makes you think,
what
would it take to make someone weep over an entire city?
That's a powerful image.
Yeah.
And it really speaks to the depth of his love and compassion, but also the gravity of the situation.
Wow. Right.
And from there, the text takes us on this journey through the history of the Jewish people.
Okay.
And it highlights this unique relationship they had with God.
Okay.
It paints this picture of a people who were chosen, blessed, and trusted with a divine mission.
And we see those incredible moments, right? The binding of Isaac on Mount Moriah, the covenant with Abraham, the building of the first and second temples.
Right. Those were pivotal moments that really shaped their identity and their relationship with God.
Right.
It's like this incredible story of faithfulness and God's providence.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. Woven through this tapestry of blessings and covenants is this recurring theme of rebellion. The text emphasizes that despite God's constant faithfulness, the Jewish people repeatedly turned away from him.
Okay.
They worshipped idols. They broke their covenant vows.
So it's this constant back and forth.
It's a cycle that played out over centuries.
Wow.
This push and pull between faithfulness and rebellion, divine grace, and human stubbornness.
It's like they just couldn't get it right.
It's like they kept taking 2 steps forward and then 3 steps back.
Yeah.
And you know what the text even compares it to?
What's that?
The parable of the unfruitful tree.
Oh.
God is depicted as this patient gardener continuing to nurture and tend to his chosen people, hoping they'll bear fruit.
Right.
He sends prophets, he offers warnings, he pleads with them to return to him.
But they just don't.
But time and again, they fall short.
And that brings us up to the coming of Jesus, the Messiah they've been waiting for.
Right there, standing right in front of them.
But they can't see it.
And that's where the text takes its really deep dive into the reasons behind Jerusalem's destruction.
Okay.
It argues that the ultimate cause wasn't Roman might or political intrigue,
Right.
but a spiritual failure. The Jewish leaders, blinded by their pride and their desire for self-preservation, rejected Jesus as the Messiah.
And that rejection wasn't just a one-time historical event.
Yeah, it goes deeper than that.
The text seems to suggest that it's something that reflects back on us and our own human tendencies.
Absolutely. That's one of the most thought-provoking aspects of this text.
Okay.
It connects the Jewish leaders' decision to sacrifice Jesus to maintain their power and their status to a universal human flaw, our tendency to prioritize self-preservation even at the expense of truth.
Wow.
We see this play out time and again throughout history and in our own lives.
It makes you wonder, how often are we making choices that protect our comfort or our image,
right,
but ultimately lead us down a destructive path?
It's an unsettling thought, isn't it?
Yeah. Are we any different from those who rejected Jesus?
That's the question the text is posing to us.
Yeah, and it's not an easy one to answer.
It's not, but it's a necessary one.
Yeah, it really challenges us to look inward.
Exactly. It forces us to ask ourselves, are we truly seeking truth?
Right.
Or are we just clinging to what makes us feel safe and secure?
Even if it means sacrificing something far more valuable.
Exactly.
And that leads us to another crucial part of this whole narrative.
Okay.
The prophecies of destruction.
Right.
Jesus didn't just weep over Jerusalem. He warned his followers about what was coming.
He did.
And the text points out specific warnings.
Right.
Like the abomination of desolation and the importance of fleeing when they saw the Roman armies surrounding the city.
Yeah. It almost sounds like a blueprint for disaster.
It does, right? Like every step of the way, there's a warning.
There's a sign.
Yeah.
And the text really dives into the significance of these prophecies.
Okay.
It explains that the abomination of desolation refers to the desecration of the temple.
Right. The heart of Jewish worship.
Exactly. And it emphasizes that Jesus's warnings weren't meant to instill fear,
Right.
but to offer a way of escape for those who heeded them.
Oh, so it's not about being afraid. It's about paying attention.
Right.
And making wise choices.
It's about discernment and action.
Like,
it's like pay attention, recognize the signs, and then make a choice.
Right.
And that's where the historical account takes this dramatic turn.
Okay.
Because the prophecies that Jesus gave weren't vague or symbolic. They were fulfilled in excruciating detail.
Wow.
The siege by Titus, the infighting among the Jewish factions, the famine, the disease. It all happened just as he foretold.
It's really hard to imagine the despair and desperation that people must have been feeling as everything was falling apart around them.
Absolutely. The text doesn't sugarcoat the horrors of what happened.
Right.
It paints this vivid picture of a city under siege, a society collapsing from within, and unimaginable suffering.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder of the consequences of rejecting God's grace and the dangers of clinging to our own ways instead of surrendering to his will.
That's a powerful thought.
It is. And it's one that I think we need to grapple with as we consider the parallels between ancient Jerusalem and our own world today.
Yeah, definitely. Before we get into that, though, let's take a quick break and we'll come back and continue this deep dive.
And, the text, it doesn't start there. It actually goes on to connect the destruction of Jerusalem.
Okay.
Not just to, human choices, but to this much broader theme of, consequences of rejecting God's grace. It's saying that this event, it wasn't just some historical tragedy. It was like this microcosm of what can happen when a whole society turns away from, God's principles.
Okay, so this idea of rejecting God's grace.
Yeah.
What do you think the text means by that?
Well, I think it goes beyond just like outward actions or rituals.
Yeah.
I think it's pointing to this deeper rejection of God's values, his moral law, his very essence.
Okay.
It suggests that, when a society forgets its moral compass, when truth and justice are sacrificed for convenience and self-interest,
right,
it sets itself on this really dangerous path.
So in a way, the destruction of Jerusalem wasn't just a punishment for specific actions.
Right.
But more like this natural consequence of a society that had lost its way.
Yeah, like a societal implosion brought on by its own internal decay.
Right, right. And here's where it starts to get even more unsettling.
Yeah.
Because the text doesn't just leave this concept in the past. It dares to draw these parallels between the spiritual decline of Jerusalem and the state of the modern world.
Yeah, and that can be a little bit unnerving for some people.
Definitely. I mean, are we talking about like end times prophecies here?
Well, I think it's understandable to feel that way.
Yeah.
But you have to remember the way that the text frames these prophecies.
Okay.
It's not so much like predictions of doom and gloom,
Okay.
but more as warnings intended to awaken us
Okay.
to the potential consequences of our choices.
So it's like a wake-up call.
Right.
To get us to examine our own lives.
And our society.
And our society.
Yeah.
In light of these historical lessons.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
So how does the text specifically connect the destruction of Jerusalem to our modern world?
Well, it argues that just as the Jewish nation turned away from God's principles, so too is our modern world drifting away from, its moral moorings.
The text points to things like, the increasing disregard for traditional values,
Right.
the rise of secularism, the growing acceptance of practices that go against biblical teachings.
So it's not just about specific actions, but a broader shift in societal attitudes and beliefs.
That's a really good way to put it.
We've forgotten the values that used to guide our moral compass.
It's like a collective amnesia.
Right.
And the text suggests that just as there were consequences for Jerusalem's rebellion, there will be consequences for our modern society's drift away from God's principles.
Okay.
And it's not presented as this punishment from a vengeful God,
Right.
but rather as this natural consequence of our choices.
Like reaping what we sow.
Exactly.
So it's like we're standing at this crossroads,
We are.
facing a similar choice to the one faced by the people in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
We can either continue down this path of self-destruction,
Ignoring the warning signs.
ignoring the warning signs, repeating the mistakes of the past, or we can choose to realign ourselves with God's principles and chart a different course.
And the text reminds us that we don't have to face this choice alone.
Right.
Just as God provided a way of escape for those Christians in Jerusalem who heeded Jesus' warnings, he offers us a way out today.
Right. And this way out,
Yeah.
it's not about physically escaping some disaster, right?
No, it's not.
It's something more internal, more spiritual.
You're absolutely right.
Okay.
The text emphasizes that the true escape is found in accepting God's grace, in turning away from our self-destructive ways,
Right.
and in making him the center of our lives.
Okay.
It's about this transformation of the heart, a realignment of our priorities, a commitment to living in accordance with God's will.
Yeah, that makes sense. But the text also talks about these signs, like signs in the sun and moon and stars, the stress of nations.
Yeah.
It's all very vivid and a little bit unsettling.
I understand.
How are we supposed to understand those signs today?
Well, I think the text is suggesting that these signs, whether they're literal or symbolic, are meant to be wake-up calls.
Okay.
They're not intended to scare us, but to shake us out of our complacency and to prompt us to examine, the direction we're heading.
So instead of getting caught up in trying to figure out specific events or dates,
Right.
the real message is to pay attention to the bigger picture,
Yes.
to recognize the patterns of decline,
Exactly.
and to take responsibility for the choices we're making both individually and as a society.
That's a very insightful way to put it.
Okay.
And I think it's also important to emphasize that the text doesn't present this fatalistic view of the future.
Right.
Yes, it highlights the potential for destruction,
Right.
but it also offers hope.
Okay.
It reminds us that God isn't just this passive observer.
Right.
He's actively involved in human history. He's constantly working to draw us back to himself,
Right.
to offer us forgiveness and redemption, and to guide us toward a better future.
So there's this sense of urgency in the text,
There is.
but also a sense of hope.
It's like it's saying, yes, the situation is serious, but it's not hopeless.
Right.
There's still time to turn things around,
To make a different choice.
to choose a path that leads to life rather than destruction.
And ultimately, that choice comes down to each individual.
It does.
Right? The text doesn't give us some blueprint for social or political reform.
It doesn't.
It doesn't tell us a set of rules to follow.
Right.
It focuses on the transformation of the heart,
Exactly.
on the individual's relationship with God.
It suggests that true change starts from within.
Okay.
And when enough individuals choose to align themselves with God's principles, that transformation will naturally spread outward, impacting families, communities, and ultimately the world around them.
Right. I appreciate how the text balances the warnings with this message of hope and individual empowerment.
Yeah, it's not about waiting for some external force to save us.
Right.
It's about taking responsibility for our own choices and becoming agents of change in our own little corners of the world.
That's a key takeaway.
It is.
And I think it's important to remember that this process of, choosing God's path,
Yeah.
it's not a one-time event. It's an ongoing journey.
It's a daily commitment
Right.
to seeking truth, to resisting temptation, and to living in accordance with God's principles.
It sounds challenging, but ultimately rewarding.
I think so.
And while the text draws these profound connections between ancient Jerusalem and our own world, it also recognizes that our time is unique.
You're right. The text doesn't just rehash old prophecies or dwell on past mistakes.
Right.
It acknowledges the unprecedented challenges and opportunities of our modern era, and it encourages us to apply those timeless principles of faith and obedience in a way that's relevant to our own context.
So it's saying, don't just read about history, learn from it.
Exactly.
Just hear the warnings, heed them.
Right.
And don't just passively observe the world around you, actively engage with it, seeking to make a positive difference.
That's a powerful call to action.
It is.
And it resonates deeply with the core message of the text, that our choices matter. Our actions have consequences, and we have the power to choose a path that leads to life.
Right. Both for ourselves and for those around us.
Exactly.
This deep dive has been incredibly thought-provoking.
It has.
We've gone from the historical context of Jerusalem's destruction to the spiritual parallels to our own world.
Yeah.
From the chilling fulfillment of prophecies to the enduring message of hope and redemption.
It's been a journey.
It really has. And it's clear that this event wasn't just some historical footnote.
No, it wasn't.
But a powerful parable with profound implications for our lives today.
I think so, too. It really has been a journey, hasn't it?
It has. I mean, from the bustling streets of ancient Jerusalem
really? Yeah.
to, the complexities of our modern world, this whole discussion has taken us through like a whirlwind of emotions. You know? Sorrow, reflection.
Yeah.
Even a bit of fear, I think.
I think so, too.
But, in the midst of all that heaviness,
yeah,
I keep coming back to that thread of hope that runs through the text.
Right.
It's like even when we're talking about destruction and despair, there's this unwavering belief in the power of redemption and the possibility of choosing a different path.
Yeah, that's really important to remember.
Yeah.
Because the text doesn't shy away from those harsh realities of judgment and consequences.
Right.
It lays bare the dangers of rejecting God's grace and the potential for, societal collapse when we stray from his principles.
And we see that so clearly in the story of Jerusalem.
We do.
A city that was chosen blessed and yet ultimately destroyed because of its persistent rebellion.
Right.
Right.
It's a stark reminder that even those who are closest to God aren't immune to the consequences of their choices.
Right. And that's where I think the text challenges us to go beyond just observing history, to actually engaging with its lessons.
Right.
It's asking us, are we making the same mistakes today?
Right. Are we as a society drifting away from those core principles that once guided our moral compass?
It's easy to get caught up in the big picture. The societal trends and global events.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming.
But the text seems to suggest that real change starts much smaller, like within the heart of each individual.
Absolutely. The text repeatedly emphasizes that while God's judgment is ultimately a collective experience, salvation is a deeply personal choice.
Okay.
It's not about earning God's favor through outward actions or rituals, but about surrendering our will to his allowing him to transform us from the inside out.
It's a reminder that even in a world that seems to be, spiraling towards chaos, we have the power to choose a different path for ourselves.
We do. We have the power to choose.
We can choose to align ourselves with God's principles, to live lives of integrity and compassion, and to be beacons of hope in our own little corners of the world.
That's beautifully said.
And it makes me think about those early Christians in Jerusalem who heeded Jesus's warnings.
They didn't try to change the whole city or stop the Roman army.
Right. They just chose to obey.
They trusted in God's guidance.
And to seek refuge in his promises.
And in doing so, they not only saved themselves,
right,
but they became these living examples of faith and obedience, a testament to the power of God's grace, even in the midst of all the turmoil.
It's inspiring to think that even in those darkest of times when everything seems lost, our individual choices can still make a difference.
They absolutely can. And that brings us to another important theme that's woven throughout the text. The reality of Christ's return.
Right.
It speaks of a time when the chaos and the suffering of this world will finally come to an end.
A time when God will make all things new.
Exactly.
It's easy to get caught up in the warnings and the potential for destruction, but the text doesn't leave us there, does it?
It doesn't.
It points us towards this future filled with hope.
Yes, a future where God's love and justice will ultimately prevail.
That's a comforting thought, especially considering all the challenges we're facing today. It gives us this sense of perspective, knowing that even in the midst of all the turmoil, there's this greater purpose unfolding.
A grand narrative of redemption in which we all have a part to play.
And that brings us back to the central message of this whole deep dive. The destruction of Jerusalem, while tragic. It's this powerful reminder that our choices matter. Our actions have consequences, and we have the power to choose a path that leads to life, both for ourselves and for those around us.
It's a call to vigilance, to discernment, and to this radical commitment to living in alignment with God's principles.
Not out of fear of punishment, but out of a deep desire to experience the fullness of His love and grace, both now and in the future.
I think that's a perfect summary of the lessons we can learn from this deep dive.
Yeah, it's challenging, it's comforting, and ultimately it empowers us to live lives of purpose and meaning.
Even in a world that often feels uncertain and chaotic.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the destruction of Jerusalem. I hope you found this exploration as thought-provoking and insightful as I have. And if you're interested in exploring more fascinating topics like this one, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives.
We'll see you next time.
Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.